The oilmen have arrived from Beijing for a ceremonial signing over of drilling rights. It's a holiday for them, the translator told me last night at the Grozny Eternity Hotel, which is both the only five-star hotel and the only hotel in the Republic. I nodded solemnly. He needn't to explain. I came of age in the reign of Brezhnev when young men would enter civil service academies hardy and robust, only to leave 2 years later anemic and stooped, cured forever of the inclination to be civil or of service to anyone. Still, Beijing must be grim if they're vacationing in Chechnya. We'll reach Grozny in 10 minutes, I announced to them in English. The translator sits in the passenger seat. He's a stalk, thin man with a head of hair so black and lustrous it looks sculpted from shoe polish. I feel a shared camaraderie with translators, as I do with deputies and underlings of all stripes. And as he speaks in slow, measured Mandarin, I hear the resigned and familiar tone of a man who knows he is more intelligent than his superiors. The road winds over what was once a roof. A verdigris-encrusted arm rises from the debris, its forefinger raised skyward. The Lenin statue had stood in the square outside the school, arm upthrust, rallying the school children to glorious revolution. But now, buried to his chin like a cowboy sentenced to death beneath the desert sun, Vladimir Ilyich waves only for help. We drive onward, passing brass bandoliers and olive flak jackets, red bandanas and golden epaulettes, the whole palette of Russian invasion painted across a thunderstorm of wreckage. Upon seeing the 02 interior ministry plate dangling below the Mercedes hood, the spies, soldiers, policemen, and armed thugs wave us through without hesitation. The streets become more navigable. Cement trucks can't make it from the cement works to the holes in the ground without being hijacked by one or another shade of our technicolor occupation and sold to Russian construction companies north of the border. So road crews salvage office doors from collapsed administration buildings and lay them across the craters. Affixed to the doors are the names and titles of those who once worked behind them. Mansur Khalidov, head of oncology, City Hospital number 6. Yacha Sagapova, assistant director of production, Ministry of Oil and Gas Industry. Perhaps my name is written over a gash in some shabby side street, supporting the weight of a stranger who glances at the placard reading Ruslan Dokurov, deputy director, Grozny Museum of Regional Art, and wonders if such a person is still alive.
A large mass grave was recently discovered outside of Grozny, no?
The translator asks.
Yes, an exciting discovery. It will be a major tourist attraction for archaeology enthusiasts.
The translator frowns.
Isn't it a crime scene? Don't be ridiculous, it's millions of years old. But weren't the bodies found shot execution style?
He insists. I shrug him off. Who am I to answer for the barbarities of prehistoric man? The translator nods to a small mountain range of rubble bulldozed just over city limits.
What's that?
Suburbs, I say. We pass backhoes, dump trucks, and jackhammers through the metallic dissonance of reconstruction, a welcome song after months of screaming shells. The cranes are the tallest man-made structures I have ever seen in person. We drive to the central square, once the hub of the municipal government, now a brown field debossed with earth mover tracks. Nadia once lived just down the road. The oilmen climb out and frown at each other, then at the translator, and then finally at me. Turning to the northeast, I point at a strip of blue sky wedged between two fat cumuli. That was Hotel Kavkaz. Abba stayed 2 nights. I carried their guitars when I worked there one summer. Next to that, picture an apartment block. Before 91, only party members lived there. And after 91, only criminals. No one moved in or out. None of the oilmen smiles. The translator leans to me and whispers,
You are aware, of course, that these 3 gentlemen are esteemed members of the Communist Party of China.
It's okay, I'm a limo driver. The translator stares blankly. Lloyd from Dumb and Dumber? Nothing. Jim Carrey, a brilliant actor who embodies the senselessness of our era, I explained. The interpreter doesn't bother translating. I continue to draw a map of the square by narration, but the oilmen can't see what I see. They witness only a barren expanse demolished by bomb and bulldozer. Come, comrades, use your imagination, I urge. But they return to the Mercedes, and I am talking solely to the translator, and then he returns to the Mercedes, and I am talking solely to myself. 3 months ago, the Interior Minister told me his idea. The proposition was ludicrous, but I listened with the blank-faced complacency I had perfected throughout my 23 years as a public servant. The United Nations has named Grozny the most devastated city on earth, the minister explained between bites of moist trout. I wasn't sure of the proper response, so offered my lukewarm congratulations. Yes, well, always nice to receive recognition, I suppose. But as you might imagine, we have an image problem. He loomed over his desk in a high-backed executive chair, while across from him I listened from an odd, leggy stool designed to make its occupant struggle to stay upright. The minister's path had first crossed mine 15 years earlier when he had sought my advice regarding a recently painted portrait of him and his sons, and I had sought his regarding a dacha near my home village. The portrait, which still hung on the far wall, depicted the three of them in tall leather boots, baggy trousers, long woolen chochas, and sheepskin papachas, heroically bestriding the carcass of a slain brown bear that bore a striking resemblance to Yeltsin. Poor investment, the minister continued. Most others don't agree with me, but I believe we need to attract capital unconnected to the Kremlin if we're to achieve a degree of economic autonomy, and holding the record for the world's largest ruin isn't helping. Rosneft wants to sink its fangs into our oil reserves, but the Chinese will cut a better deal. Have you heard of Oleg Voronov? He's on the Rosneft board, 14th richest man in Russia, and one of the hawks who pushed for the 1994 invasion. The acquisition of Chechen oil is among his top priorities. The minister set down his silverware and began sorting through the little pile of bones on his plate, reconstructing the skeleton of the fish he had consumed. If we're to entice foreign investment, we need to rebrand Chechnya as the Dubai of the Caucasus. That's where you come in. You're, what, the deputy, the director of Museum of Regional Art? Deputy director, sir. Ah, that's right, deputy director. You did fine work sending those paintings to Moscow. A real PR coup. Even British newspapers wrote about the Tretyakov exhibit. With a small nod, I accepted the compliment for what was the lowest point of my rut-ridden career. In 1999, Russian rockets demolished the museum. With my staff, I saved what I could from the ensuing fires. Soon after, I was ordered to surrender the salvaged works to the Russians. When I saw that I'd been listed as co-curator of an exhibit of Chechen paintings at Moscow's Tretyakov Gallery, I closed my lids and wondered what had happened to all the things my eyes had loved. The minister tilted the plate over the rubbish bin, and the ribs slid from the spine of the fish. Nothing suggests stability and peace like a thriving tourism sector, he said. I think you'd be the perfect candidate to head the project. With respect, sir, I said, the subject of my dissertation was 19th century pastoral landscapes. I'm a scholar. This is all a bit beyond me. I'll be honest, Ruslan. For this position, we need someone with 3 qualifications. First, he must speak English. Second, he must know enough about the culture and history of the region to convey that Chechnya is much more than a recovering war zone, that we possess a rich heritage unsullied by violence. Third, and most important, he must be that rare government man without links to human rights abuses on either side of the conflict. Do you meet these qualifications? I do, sir, I said, but still, I'm entirely unqualified to lead a tourism initiative. The minister frowned. He scanned the desk for a napkin before reaching over to wipe his oily fingers on my necktie. According to your dossier, you've worked in hotels. When I was 16, I was a bellhop. Well, the minister beamed, then you clearly have experience in the hospitality industry. In the suitcase carrying industry. So you accept? I said nothing, and as is often the case with men who possess more power than wisdom, he took my silence for affirmation. Congratulations, Russell. You're head of the Grozny Tourist Bureau. And so my future was decided, as has become custom, entirely without my consent. Over the following weeks, I designed a brochure. The central question was how to trick tourists into coming to Grozny voluntarily. For inspiration, I studied pamphlets from the bureaus of other urban hellscapes: Baghdad, Pyongyang, Houston. From then, I learned to be lavishly adjectival, to treat prospective visitors as semi-literate gluttons, to impute reports of kidnapping, slavery, and terrorism to the slander of foreign provocateurs. Thrilled by my discovery, I tucked a notebook into my shirt pocket and raced into the street. Upon seeing the empty space where an apartment block once stood, I wrote, "Wide and unobstructed skies." I watched jubilantly as a pack of feral dogs chased a man and noted, "Unexpected encounters with wildlife." The city bazaar hummed with sales of looted industrial equipment, humanitarian aid rations, and munitions suited for every occasion. Unparalleled shopping opportunities. Even before reaching the first checkpoint, I'd scribbled, "First-rate security." The copy was easy. Real challenge was finding an image to substantiate. After all, the siege had transfigured the city. Debris rerouted roads through abandoned warehouses. Once I found a traffic jam on a factory floor, and what was not rerouted was raised. A photograph of my present surroundings would send a cannonball through my verbiage-fortified illusion of a romantic paradise for heterosexual couples, and I couldn't find suitable alternatives of pre-war Grozny with the destroyed archives. In the end, I forewent photographs altogether and instead used visuals from January, April, and August of the 1984 Grozny Museum of Regional Art calendar. In the three 19th century landscapes, swallows frolic over ripening grapevines, and a shepherd minds his flock, backlit by a sunset. They portray a land untouched by war or communism, and beside them, my descriptions of a picturesque Chechnya do not seem entirely dishonest. After depositing the troika of Chinese oilmen at the Interior Ministry, I go home. I knock on the door of the flat adjacent to mine and announce my name. Nadia appears in a headscarf and sunglasses. Turning her unscarred side toward me, she invites me in. "How was the maiden voyage?" "An excellent success," I say. "They dozed off before we reached the worst of the wreckage." Nadia smiles and takes measured steps to the Primus stove. She doesn't need her white cane to reach the counter. I scan the room for impediments, yet everything is in order. Nothing on the floorboards but the kopek coins I glued down in paths to the bathroom, the kitchen, the front door, so her bare feet could find their way in their early months of blindness. The kettle whistles in the kitchen. We sip tea from mismatched mugs that lift rings of dust from the tabletop. She sits to hide the left half of her face. "The tourist brochures will be ready next week," I say. I'll have to send one along to our Beijing comrades if the paintings come out clearly. "You used 3 from the Zakharov room?" "Yes, 3 Zakharovs." Her shadow nods on the wall. That gallery, the museum's largest, had been her favorite too. The first time I ever saw her was there, in 1987, on her first day as the museum's restoration artist. "You'll have to save me one," she says, "for when I can see it." Her last sentence hangs in the air for a moment, long moment, before I respond. "I have an envelope with 5,000 rubles for your trip. I'll leave it on your nightstand." "Ruslan, please. St. Petersburg is a city engineered to steal money from visitors. I know. I'm in the industry." "You don't need to take care of me," she says, with a firm but appreciative squeeze of my fingers. "I keep telling you. I've been saving my disability allowance. I have enough for the bus ticket, and I'm staying with a cousin of a university classmate. It's not for you, it's for the movies, for video cassettes." I say it beat too quickly. Slapstick and romantic comedies have been my favorite genres in recent years. Find some that are foreign. She's looking straight at me, or at my voice, momentarily forgetting the thing that her face has become. We were together when the rockets turned 3 floors of our city's preeminent works of art into an inferno she barely escaped. The 3rd-degree burns hardened into a chapped canvas of scar tissue wrapping the left side of her skull. That eye is gone, yet the other was partly spared. In the heat, her right lids fused together, sealing her eye from the worst of the flames, and at times, it can sense the flicker of light, the faintest movements. There is the possibility, an ophthalmologist has told her, that sight could be restored. However, any optical surgeon clever enough to perform such a delicate operation is also clever enough to have fled Grozny long ago for a city like St. Petersburg, where she has several appointments arranged. If it happens, the surgery, if it's successful, I say, you don't need to leave. What I need is sleep. When I return to my flat, I rinse my hands in the sink and let the water run even after they're clean. Indoor plumbing was restored 6 months ago. Above the doorway hangs a bumper sticker with a fish with WWJCD inscribed across its body, sent by an American church, along with a crate of Bibles in response to our plea for life-saving aid. I take a dozen scorched canvases from the closet and lay them on the floor in 2 rows of 6. They were too damaged for the Tretyakov exhibit. Not one was painted after 1879, and yet they look like the surreal visions of a psychedelic adult mind. Most are charred through, some simply mounted ash, more reminiscent of Alberto Buri's slash-and-burn Tashism than the Imperial Academy of Arts classicism. In others, the heat-melted oils have turned photorealistic portraits into dissolved dreamscapes. My closet holds one last canvas. I set it on the coffee table to examine by the light of an unshaded lamp. The seamless gradation of color, the nearly invisible brushstrokes, not even the 3 years I spent writing my dissertation on Pyotr Zakharov-Chechenets could diminish my fascination with his work. Born in 1816 on the eve of the Caucasian War that Lermontov, Tolstoy, and Pushkin would later memorialize in their story cycle, he was an orphan before his 4th birthday. Yet his brilliance so exceeded his circumstances that he went on to attend the Imperial Academy in St. Petersburg. And despite exclusion from scholarship, employment, and patronage due to his ethnicity, he eventually became a court painter and a member of the Academy. He was a Chechen who learned to succeed by the rules of his conquerors, a man not unlike the interior minister, to be admired and pitied. A meadow, an apricot tree, a stone wall, and a diagonal meander through the grasses, the pasture cresting into a hill, a boarded well, a house. It's among the least ambitious of all Zakharov's work. Here is an artist who painted the portraits of Tsar Nicholas I, General Alexei Yermolov, and Grand Duchess Maria Nikolaevna, and the famed depiction of Imam Shamil's surrender, and this, in my hands, portrays all the drama its title suggests. Empty pasture in afternoon. I grew up in the Southern Highlands, just a few kilometers from the pasture. Though the land was technically part of a state farm, nothing was ever planted. Flocks were banned from grazing because no one liked the idea of sheep relieving themselves on Zakharov's soil. During secondary school, on a class trip to the Grozny Museum of Regional Art, I finally beheld the canvas that existed with greater vibrance in village lore than it could ever gather on the gallery wall. More than anything, it was that painting that led me to study art at university. And there I met and married Liana. We lived with my parents in cramped quarters well into our 20s and found the privacy to speak openly only in deserted public areas, on the roof of the village schoolhouse, in the waiting room of the shuttered clinic, in Zakharov's pasture. After I received my doctorate and a position at the museum, we relocated to a Grozny flat where we learned to talk in bed. The USSR fell. We had a son. With the assistance of the interior minister, I purchased the dacha in Zakharov's pasture amid the frenzied privatization of the post-Soviet pre-war years. When the First War began, I stayed in Grozny to protect the museum from the alternating advances of foreign soldiers and local insurgents. My wife and son fled to the dacha, far from the conflict. In my research for the Tourist Bureau, I've learned that the First and Second Chechen Wars have rendered the Republic among the most densely mined regions in human history. The United Nations estimates that 500,000 were planted, roughly 1 for every 2 citizens. I was unaware of this statistic when I visited the dacha during the First War, taking what provisions I could from the ruined capital, a few treats for which I paid dearly, tea leaves for my wife, sheets of fresh drawing paper for my son. But I knew enough to warn my family never to venture into the pasture. Initially, they heeded my words. I don't know how it happened on that May Day in 1996. If they were pursued by depraved men, if the perilous field were a relative sanctuary, if they were afraid, if they called for help, if they called for me. I'd like to believe that it was a day so beautiful they couldn't resist the crest of the hill, the open sky, that radiance. I'd like to believe that my wife suggested a picnic, that their penultimate moment was one of whimsy, charm. I'd like to believe anything to counter the more probable realities at the edge of my imagination. With terror or joy, with abasement or delight, they remained my wife and child to the end. I must remind myself of this, because in the mystery that subsumes those final moments, they are strangers to me. I was in Grozny at the museum and never heard the explosion. For the 2 weeks Nadia is in Petersburg, my evenings stagnate. Twice I go to Nadia's flat to clean her bedroom closet, the back corners of the shelves, behind the toilet, the little places that even in her fastidiousness she misses. I must make myself into a crutch she cannot risk discarding. One Wednesday night, feeling unusually alert given the hour, I contemplate Zakharov's pasture. It's the least ruined of the canvases, the principal damage, aside from the stains of ash and soot, being the burn hole at its center, upon the hill, which I see as the aftermath, not of the museum fire, but of the mine blast, the crater into which everything disappeared. A few years ago, Nadia could have restored it in days. An idea. I let myself back into her flat to retrieve her restoration kit. It's at the desk, beside a stack of late 19th century photographs. In one, there's a boy, chubby face and gray eyes, tousled hair like a fountain pen scribble, barely noticeable in the crowd. I feel him staring up at me with an intensity approaching sentience. And for a moment, I'm immobilized. How did he die? I've never before asked such a question about a child who is not my son. Back home, I set the kit beside the Zakharov. Plastic bottles of emulsion cleaner, neutralizer, gloss varnish, conditioner, varnish remover, a tin of putty, 8 meters of canvas lining, a depleted packet of cotton-tipped swabs, a dozen disposable chloroprene gloves. I'd taken a year-long course in conservation at the university, but my real education came from Nadia when in the months after my family died, I neglected my duties as deputy director and spent most afternoons in her office watching her work. Every evening for the next week, I snap on the chloroprene gloves and wash away the surface dirt with cotton balls dampened in neutralizer. The emulsion cleaner smells of fermented watermelon, and I apply it with the swabs in tight circles until the tips gray and the unadulterated color of Zakharov's palette is revealed. Employing the repair putty as sealant, I patch the burn hole with a square of fresh canvas. Then I paint. The totality of my attention is focused on an area the size of a halved playing card. The grass, turned emerald by sunlight, must be flawless, and I spend several hours testing different blends of oils. As I apply them with delicate brushstrokes, I realize that even in his rendering of a distant field, Zakharov is beyond imitation, and that were Nadia here to witness my final infidelity, she would never forgive me. With precise, strong lines, I draw them as silhouettes. The boy's arms are raised, his body elongated as he makes for the crest, his head thrown back in rapture. The woman hurries a step behind, animated by his anticipation. Their backs are to me. The sun rakes the grass and ripe apricots bend the branches. No one chases them. They run from nothing. Nadia has returned, and the white tea has cooled in our cups. And still she hasn't mentioned this Petersburg eye surgeons. Good news, she says, and feels across the floor for her suitcase, then hands me 2 VHS tapes. These are the ones you wanted, right? I examine the cases. Soviet comedies, sadly. Yes, these are exactly the ones. I was afraid the street vendor had swindled me. What do the doctors say, Nadia? The pause is long enough to peel a plum. She delivers her reply with a downcast frown. Reconstructive surgery is possible. I force as much gusto as I can muster into my congratulations, slapping a palm on the table while my spine wilts. What will I be if Nadia no longer needs me? This is truly good news, though of course it is. But her face is joyless. What's wrong? Is there a long wait for the operation? There won't be one. What? What? Why not? Too expensive. She's facing the empty chair across the table, thinking that I'm still sitting there. 115,000. 115,000 rubles. A huge, yet not impossible sum. Years to save for, but within the realm of possibility, like a vacation to Belarus. I'm already scheming ways to defraud the Interior Ministry when she says, dollars. My heart spirals and crash lands somewhere deep in my gut. At 33 rubles to $1, the figure is insurmountable. Nadia reaches for her purse and pulls out an envelope. What I owe you for the trip. Help me count it out, she says. For a moment, her instinct is to trust anyone. Her instinct to trust anyone, even me, is infuriating. Isn't suspicion the natural condition of the blind? Haven't I warned her, told her to be careful, cautioned that she can't rely on anyone? But by some perversion, she's become more credulous, more willing to believe that people aren't by nature hucksters and scoundrels, which is why I suppose my VHS collection is rounded out with gentlemen of fortune. It's nothing, I say. I'm paying you back. If you want to be a martyr, go and join them in the woods. Help me count it out, she insists, her voice stern, cool, serious. I still have money left from the disability fund. I'm not a charity. Of course there's no disability fund. Of course the government isn't providing her a stipend or subsidizing the flat adjacent to mine. The cash delivered in the Interior Ministry envelope on the first of the month comes from me, as does her rent. I'm waiting, she says. We both know this is a farce. But I sit beside her. I play my part in the lie that preserves the illusion that our friendship, our romance, whatever this is based on affection rather than dependence. I count the bills that I will return to her, and we shake hands as if our business is concluded, as if there is nothing left that we owe one another. In bed, I run my fingers through what remains of her hair, press my fingertips to her cheeks, slowly scrolling to decipher the dense braille scrawled across her face. I slide my hand down her torso, over the bulge of her left breast, the hook of her hip bone, to thighs so smooth and unmarked, they're hers only in darkness. She turns away. Lying here, I nearly forget the falling rockets, the collapsing museum, the cinder blocks shifting like ice cubes in a glass, the air of a clean sky and possibly distant. The Zakharov was in my hands when I found her, her face halved, her teeth chattering. I nearly forget how I lifted her cheek to cool it with my breath, how her broken eyes searched for me as I held her. So many times I've warned her of monsters, ready to prey on the vulnerable, and as she turns, I nearly forget to ask myself, what monster have I become today? In the morning, I return to my flat and find the paintings on the floor where I left them. Daylight grants the scorch and char an odd beauty, as if the fires haven't destroyed the works, but revised them into expressions of a brutal present. I pick up the nearest one, a family portrait commissioned by a nobleman as a wedding present for his second son. The top third of the canvas has been incinerated, taking with it the heads of the nobleman, his wife, the first son, and the newly betrothed. But their bodies remain, dressed in soot-stained breeches and petticoats, and by their feet sits a dachshund, so fat its little legs barely touch the ground, the only figure in a painting intended to convey the family's immortal honor to survive intact. I hang the canvas on the wall from a bent nail and step back, marveling that here, for the first time in my career, I've displayed a work of modern art. After pulling the furniture into the kitchen, I hang the remaining canvases throughout the living room, finally coming to the restored Zakharov, which I consider returning to the closet, where it would exist in darkness for me alone, but my curatorial instincts win out, and I mount it beside the others, where it is meant to be. I scroll a sign on the cardboard shingle and nail it to the door. Grozny Museum of Regional Art. Over the following weeks, I bring all my tours through the museum. A delegation from the Red Cross, more Chinese oilmen, a heavyweight boxing champion, a British journalist. This is what remains, the canvases cry. You cannot burn ash. You cannot raise rubble. As the only museum employee, I give myself a long overdue promotion. Henceforth, I am director. The newly installed telephone rings one morning and the gloomy interior minister greets me. We're properly fucked. Nice to hear from you, sir, I replied. I'm still in my sleeping clothes, and even for a phone conversation, I feel unsuitably dressed. The Chinese are out. They traded their drilling right to Rosneft for a few dozen Russian fighter jets. I nod, grasping why Beijing didn't send its shrewdest or most sober representatives. So, this means Rosneft will drill. Yes, and it gets even worse. He heaves. I may well be demoted to deputy minister. I was a deputy for many years. It's not as bad as you think. When the world takes a dump, it lands on a deputy's forehead. I couldn't deny that. What does this mean for the tourist bureau? You should find new employment, but first, you have one final tour. Oleg Voronov from Rosneft. It takes a beat for the name to register. The 14th richest man in Russia? 13th now. With respect, sir, I give tours to human rights activists, print journalists, state and corporate underlings. People of no power or importance. What does a man of his stature want with me? My question precisely, yet apparently his wife, Galina something or other over, the actress, has heard of this art museum you've cobbled together. What have you been up to? It's a long story, sir. You know I hate stories. But do show him our famed Chechen hospitality, perhaps with a glass of unboiled tap water. Let's give the 13th richest man in Russia an intestinal parasite. I understand, sir. I'm a limo driver. 3 weeks pass, and here he is, Oleg Voronov, in the backseat of the Mercedes with his wife, the actress Galina Ivanova. Sitting up front is his assistant, a bleached blonde parcel of productivity who takes notes even when no one is speaking. Still try as I might, I'm unable to properly hate Voronov. So far he's been non-talkative, inattentive, and uncurious. In short, a perfect tourist. Galina, on the other hand, has read Hasan Geshelov's Origins of Chechen Civilization and recites historical trivia unfamiliar to me. As the office doors of dead administrators clatter beneath us, she asks thoughtful questions, treating me not as a servant or even as a tour guide, but as a scholar. I casually mention the landmines, the street children, the rape and torture and indiscriminate suffering, and Voronov and his wife shake their heads with sympathy. Nothing I say will turn them into the masks of evil I want them to be, and when the oligarch checks his watch, a cheap plastic piece of crap, I feel an affinity for a man who deserves its opposite. The tour concludes at my flat. As I open the door, I say, this is what remains of the Grozny Museum of Regional Art. Voronov and Galina pass the burned-out frames to the pasture. Is this the one? Yes, sir. She nods. A Zakharov, no? He inquires, fingering his lapel as he turns to me. There was an exhibit of his at the Tretyakov, if memory serves. Only now do I recognize clearly the animals I have invited into my home. When the museum was bombed, the fires destroyed most of the original collection. We sent what was saved to the Tretyakov. But not this. Not this. Rather reckless, don't you think, to leave such a treasure on the apartment wall? That's a minor mark. Believe it or not, my wife has been looking for a Zakharov. She collects art from every region I drill. Could I offer you a glass of water? You could offer me the painting. I force a laugh. He laughs too. We are laughing. Ha ha! The painting is not for sale, I say. His mirth disappears. It is if I want to buy it. This is a museum. You can't have a painting just because you want it. The director of the Tretyakov wouldn't sell you the art from his walls just because you can afford it. You are only a deputy director, and this isn't Tretyakov. There's real pity in his voice now, as he now surveys the ash flaking from the canvases, the dirty dishes stacked in the sink, and yes, now, at last, I hate him. I have a penthouse gallery in Moscow, temperature and moisture controlled, first-rate security. No one but Galina and I and a few guests will ever see it. You must realize that I'm being more than reasonable. And in a less than subtle threat, he nods out to the window to the street below, where his three-armed Goliaths skulk beside their Land Rover. What is the painting worth? It's worth, I begin, but how can I finish? What price can I assign to the last Zakharov in Chechnya, to the last image of my home? One sum comes to mind, but it terrifies me. Wouldn't that be the worst of all outcomes? To lose both the Zakharov and Nadia in the same transaction? Just take it. I say, you took everything else. Take this too. Voronov bristles. I'm not a thief. Tell me what it's worth. My gaze floats and lands upon the bumper sticker, WWJCD. What would he do? Jim Carrey would be brave. No matter how difficult, Jim Carrey would do the right thing. I close my eyes. $115,000 US. 115? I nod. That's what, 3.7, 3.8 million rubles? Voronov fixes me with a venomous stare, then turns to his wife, who still hasn't glanced away from the painting. I look into it, too, to its retreating figures, wondering if we might be reunited soon. A single fleshy clap startles me like a gunshot, and I spin to find Voronov smiling once more. Let's make it an even 4, he says expansively. The assistant unyokes herself from a mammoth purse and spills 8 stacks of banded 5,000 ruble bills onto the floor. Never trust banks, Voronov says. You can have that advice for free. It's been a pleasure. He slaps my back, tells the assistant to bring the canvas, and heads for the door. Then he's gone. Galina remains at the Zakharov. Even as I'm losing it, I'm proud my painting can elicit such sustained attention. She smiles apologetically, touches my shoulder, and follows her husband out. I'm left with the assistant, whose saccharine perfume reeks of vaporized cherubs. And you'll have to give us a curatorial description, she says. Something we can mount on a placard. She passes me the notepad, and I stand before my painting for a long while before I begin. Notice how the shadows in the meadow mirror the clouds in the sky, how the leaves of the apricot tree blow with the grass. No verisimilitude escapes such a master. The wall of white stones cuts an angle across the composition, both establishing depth and offsetting the horizon line. Channels of turned soil run along the left flank of the hill, as if freshly dug graves or recently buried landmines. But closer inspection reveals the furrows of a newly planted herb garden. The first shoots of rosemary already peek out. Zakharov portrays all the peace and tranquility of a spring day. The sun shines comfortingly, and hours remain before nightfall. Toward the crest of the hill, nearing the horizon, you may notice what look to be the ascending figures of a woman and a boy. Pay them no mind, for they are merely the failures of a novice restoration artist, no more than his shadows. They are not